Hello, welcome. Welcome to our first kickoff webinar for the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program. The policy conference was unfortunately canceled. We're all well aware of the reasons, but COVID-19 will mean a change in how we communicate with our colleagues, and we're excited about this webinar series. So this first event will include Dan Sperling, Founding Director of ITS Davis, as well as Susan Shaheen, Director of the Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative and UC Berkeley Professor, as well as Selita Reynolds, General Manager of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. We're thrilled to have all of these speakers with us, and we'll have more of an introduction of those of our speakers in a moment. I will mention that our next webinar is announced, is decided for May 18th at 2 p.m. The topic is equity, community, and the three revolutions. So we can give you some more information about that at the close of today's session, and we'll receive some information about that webinar in your email box. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dan Sperling, and he'll introduce our other guests. Dan Sperling, not only is he founding director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis, is also a distinguished Blue Planet Prize professor of civil environmental engineering at UC Davis. He is also the author of the book, Three Revolutions, Steering Automated, Shared, and Electric Vehicles to a Better Future, released in February 2018. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dan. Thank you so much, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Molly. And, I want to say Molly's done an incredible job, not only organizing this webinar, but the Three Revolutions Policy Conference that never happened last month, and our entire Three Revolutions Policy Program at UC Davis. So I want to say, we are at a crossroad here, and we were even before the pandemic arrived. Most of the changes taking place from this pandemic at this time, they're actually accelerating, exaggerating trends that were already starting to happen. So this is an extraordinary time for our society, for our economy, including transportation, which of course is the topic for today. For many decades, we saw very little system innovation in transportation, especially passenger transportation. Then, about 10 years ago, it all started to change. There was one of the three revolutions that we talk about, electric vehicles. About 10 years ago, they became a serious option, and all the major car companies launched massive electric vehicle commercialization programs, with Tesla leading the way. And so what we see now and what we know now is electrification of passenger vehicles, and probably even most trucks, is inevitable. So then we see, the question is timing. The second revolution started about the same time, about 10 years ago. Lyft and Uber launched demand responsive ride-hailing services in San Francisco. And then a large number of other companies, ride-hailing companies around the world, soon launched similar services. And then we saw, even more recently, we saw all the shared bikes and shared scooters sweeping through most of our major cities. And then there's the third revolution. So about that same time again, about 10 years ago, Google announced its intention to commercialize autonomous vehicles, what I would say should more accurately be called automated vehicles. Within a few years, by 2015, every major car company in the world was ramping up their automated driving investments. While there was considerable hype at the time, and to some extent there still is, it's also true that automation technology is continuing to advance quickly. The pandemic, the COVID-19 virus, has had dramatic short-term impacts on car use, on transit, on flying, aviation, on scooters, on bikes, on goods movement, as well as these advanced technologies. We've seen a large drop in car use, about 50%, an even larger drop off in transit use, and as well as ride hailing and jet travel. But we've also seen an increase in bike use. And all of these have huge implications for our economy, for our environment, for our social well-being. So our topic today is which changes, which behaviors are likely to persist, and what do we, policymakers, businesses, researchers, what do we do about it? So we have two extraordinary speakers with exactly the expertise and experience to help us answer these questions. So the first speaker will be Susan Shaheen, Dr. Susan Shaheen. She's director of the Resilience and Innovative Mobility Initiative of the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies. And this is a coming together of the ITSs at UCLA, UC Irvine, UC Davis, and UC Berkeley. So she's overseeing that. She's also a professor of civil engineering at UC Berkeley and co-director of their Transportation Sustainability Research Center. She's devoted her professional career to innovative mobility solutions, beginning with her PhD dissertation on smart car sharing, in which she launched the first smart car sharing program in the world in collaboration with a number of automotive and other companies. Susan's published prolifically on advanced mobility and won many awards, including the Roy Crum Award of TRB, the Transportation Research Board, its highest research award. And she will be chair of TRB next year. And oh, did I mention that she was my star PhD student at UC Davis when she was a teenager and I was 21? Just kidding. So she'll start it out, and then Selita will follow. And Selita Reynolds is general manager of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, the second largest municipal transportation agency in the country. She was appointed by Mayor Eric Garcetti in 2014. Under Selita's leadership, LA DOT has launched the largest scooter program in the world, the largest electric vehicle car sharing program in the world, in the country, and the first of its kind digital platform to manage the ride-hailing companies, the TNCs, and other mobility companies. She's played an increasingly prominent role across the US and the world with advanced mobility. She served as president of the National Association of City Transportation Officials for 4 years, which represents cities and transportation agencies in the US, Canada, and Mexico. She's board chair and founding member of the Open Mobility Foundation, a public-private forum created to tackle technical issues related to emerging mobility technology. And in 2019, last year, she joined the board of the Intelligent Transportation Society of America. And so you can tell, these are extraordinary, the perfect speakers for what these questions. So let me turn it over to Susan. And Susan's going to have a few slides to kind of frame this discussion. So Susan, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dan, and thanks to you and Molly for putting this together and inviting me and Selita. And Selita and I are delighted to be representing women on this panel. So thanks for also including women in your thoughts on this particular topic. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the changes and the crises and the opportunities that we see in mobility due to COVID-19. I'm going to start out with the challenges, and then as part of the challenges, I want to focus quite a bit on social equity considerations. And following that, with any good crisis, there's an opportunity. So let's talk about the opportunities that lie ahead for us. I want to really focus keenly on two particular areas: public transportation impacts of COVID, as well as impacts on shared mobility itself, and then wrap up with some concluding thoughts that might provoke some of our discussion around navigating this new normal. So, as you are all aware, the COVID-19 crisis has come about and it has caused devastating economic impacts, and many of which we are going to see for some time into the foreseeable future. And those impacts have also happened with respect to transportation. Dan mentioned a number of those. We're seeing definitely a reduction in vehicle miles traveled due to the shelter-in-place orders. And you can see here from across a number of cities in the United States, those numbers and those reductions are quite dramatic. And along with any good VMT reduction comes a reduction in our gas tax revenues. So our funding streams that help us to pay for our transportation systems. We've also seen our public transit industry reducing their schedules, their operating hours, and their routes as a result of COVID-19. We've also seen that some drivers have hit the road at pretty high speeds. So we're hearing a lot about some crashes that are happening from reckless driving in the news. We've also seen in the shared mobility space that a number of companies are redirecting their services to support COVID-19. There's been some closures, and there's also been some layoffs that we've seen occur. And one thing that I think is really important as we look at the crisis is the need for us in the transportation industry to unite, to quickly address the impacts of this immediate job crisis and its relationships to transportation as we think to restoring a safe and healthy mobility system. Social equity considerations, I think, are extraordinarily important for us to consider, particularly as we look to the interrelationships among job and food access, housing, public health, and mobility, the trade-offs that a lot of households are going to have to make between buying food, paying a car loan, or paying for their rent. We really need to ensure that lack of mobility does not lead to or exacerbate further poverty and homelessness. And we really need to look at opportunities for the public transit industry, for cities, for private companies, all of us to work together to build strong economic resilience, and particularly with the thought of protecting our most vulnerable populations. So while we focus on the crisis, I think we really need to focus on the opportunities. And that's why I'm so delighted to be with you today on this panel, is I do think that there's a number of critical opportunities. First, we've seen a 6% drop in carbon dioxide emissions for the year, predicted for the total year of 2020. And to contrast that with Paris targets, that would be to meet our 2030 Paris targets, we talked about a 7.6% reduction being required to meet that. So you can see how significant this reduction in VMT is in terms of our air quality and climate change status. We've also seen, as I've talked about, a reduction in VMT, and along with that, the number of car crashes has gone down. We've seen globally a lot more focus on active transportation policies, Milan announcing 22 miles of streets to be converted to bike and pedestrian spaces, along with Buenos Aires also thinking about the same. There's more opportunities to slow our streets down. We've seen that in the Bay Area. Opportunities to continue telecommuting, for shared mobility to continue to fill gaps in our transportation network, and an opportunity for us to look at public transit overall. I think it's going to be critical as we move forward to focus on policy, partnerships, and people. So those are my new 3 Ps as we think about COVID-19, and really using and galvanizing these 3 Ps to create a much more equitable, innovative, sustainable, and resilient transportation system moving forward. So as I mentioned, I want to speak a little bit about impacts that we're seeing to public transit in a little bit more detail, along with shared mobility. APTA has forecast a reduction in fare box revenues of approximately 75% over just the next 6 months. The reduction in hours and routes has occurred, but we've also seen increasing off-peak and low-density services, and an example of that is Miami. We've also seen tremendous relief coming in through the CARES Act to the tune of $25 billion in emergency funding to help our public transit agencies. But that will not be enough. We will definitely need more. I'm sure we'll talk about that soon. So Transit App recently did a survey and had a webinar, and these are some of the results that came in from that I think are interesting to highlight here. This survey was done across Canada and the US. So you can see about 15,000 people responded to this in the United States and about 10,000 in Canada. And active public transit users were skewed towards low-income individuals. So people who are essential workers were largely still using public transit. Food and service and healthcare represent the greatest percentage of the active travelers. And again, that reflects our essential workers. But we saw very little mode shift for those who are still traveling in both the United States and Canada. And interestingly, when we look just to the Los Angeles area responding to the transit app, we see that Spanish speakers are more likely to continue public transit. You can see that in this particular graph here. So one of the key things that I think we're going to be facing is rebuilding the public's trust in public transportation. And in this slide, I indicate two different scenarios. One is of a very likely decline and continued decline in public transit use and a slow recovery, in part due to social distancing measures and perhaps fear of higher occupancy vehicles. Other things that could lead to a slower recovery or more transit decline is multiple waves of COVID-19. But on the flip side, when we look to a more positive future, a public transit renaissance, we could see more riders relying on public transit because they can no longer afford an auto. So we could see some increases there. We could also see increases due to innovations and bold policy measures, which I'm really looking forward to talking about, things like microtransit options and free transit. And another thing that we do think is important to consider is flexible financial models that can help to reinforce a public transit renaissance. Looking towards shared mobility, we've seen a varied range of micromobility impacts. We've seen increases in public bike sharing systems through the City Bike system in New York City, increasing by 67 percentage points compared to just a year before, largely due to COVID. Washington, D.C.'s Capital Bike Sharing System, expanding their low-income access program to $5 annual memberships. We've also seen other communities requesting fleet reductions or bans on micromobility due to transmission concerns of COVID-19, and in some cases, layoffs in our micromobility companies. In mid-April, Lime suspended all their service in markets outside of all of their markets except South Korea. And we've also seen some innovations in terms of introducing cleanliness standards and using technology like nanoseptic handlebars to help confront hygiene-related issues. With respect to ride-hailing or transportation network companies and pooling, we've seen dramatic usage declines. We've also seen partnerships for essential workers to get them to work, but to also get individuals to medical appointments. And to prevent the spread of COVID, in mid-March, Lyft and Uber suspended their pooled ride options due to transmission concerns. So as I wrap up, just wanted to talk about how we navigate this new normal. I think with every good crisis, there is an opportunity, as I mentioned. So how can we work together in the transportation industry to create many new opportunities? We think the role of public policy is going to be critical to this, to seizing this opportunity. Public transit finance, locking in more telecommuting behaviors, bringing in micromobility to provide those critical transit-related services, for example. A focus on people should be central to our response. We should also try to maximize the societal and environmental benefits in transportation recovery, particularly with an eye towards social equity. How can shared mobility help households that are no longer able to afford a personal vehicle? How can shared mobility be there for people who have lost their mobility but still need to travel long distances to get to work? And how can we understand opportunities to support taxi drivers and TNC workers who have invested in car loans to generate their income? How can we make sure that they land on their feet? So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and for your time, and wrap up and turn it back to Dan.
Well, thank you, Susan, for framing this discussion really well. Before I turn it over to Selita, I want to emphasize that after Selita will talk for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then we're going to we'll have some discussion among the three of us, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So we'll leave at least 15 minutes for Q&A. So you can see that there's a button there for doing Q&A. So please submit any questions you have. A few of you already have, and we'll look forward to more. So Selita, what do you think? You're on the front lines down there in LA. You're experiencing this firsthand. You're the one that has to make a lot of the decisions about how do we manage all of these challenges that Susan was talking about. Any insights?
I don't know about insights, but I can certainly share some observations. And I really appreciate the opportunity to join you all. Both I'm a big longtime fan of both of your work, and really excited to be part of the conversation, and really hopefully what will be a broad conversation, because it really is going to fall on the shoulders of institutions like UC Davis and Cal and the Institute of Transportation Studies and transportation centers all around the United States, ITS America, NACTO, to kind of step up and make sure that transportation gets its due in terms of the depth of and richness of the conversation we could be having. Because as y'all know, transportation usually ends up bearing the burden of policy failures in other sectors. So, we have very long commutes because we failed to build adequate housing near transit, and we have or we've failed to have sort of excellent public schools, and so parents have to move around to get their kids into schools that they can afford, and that may be really far away from where they work. And we're the ones that sort of need to fix that or to solve it. And I'm not seeing anything really different happening during the pandemic. So, because we have these really amazing heroes, the healthcare workers on the front lines, keeping a failing healthcare system together, that is consuming almost all of the discourse and the thinking and the policy work of a lot of our policymakers. It's just trying to hold things together and keep our hospitals from becoming overwhelmed. And so we have to figure out how to make some space for this discussion in the midst of all of this, because the opportunities are really large. So just a snapshot of what's going on in Los Angeles. It's very similar to probably what a lot of other people in cities are experiencing right now. Traffic is down anywhere from 40 to 50% across the board at the intersections that we monitor and keep our eye on. But that also means speeds are up by anywhere from 12 to 30% across the board as well. And at the same time, bike riding, and sort of where we count, is only down about 13%. But transit ridership, the LADOT transit service that we operate, Dash and Commuter Express, is down anywhere from 75 to 90% in terms of the overall ridership. And there are a few lines where you can see where it really continues to keep a lot of people on the bus. And those are the places where it really is a lifeline service for frontline workers who don't have another way of getting around. And so I think those are those stats are familiar. Crashes are down citywide, 12%. Deaths are down from traffic violence. They're down about 22%. And that includes pedestrian deaths, down about 24% because of the overall reduction in VMT. That's a normal phenomenon that we see. But there's a couple of other statistics that are maybe hidden below the surface that are worth thinking about too. So I manage a core of 600 traffic officers, parking enforcement, traffic control officers, including crossing guards. And this year over last year, the number of hours that we are spending directing traffic has almost doubled by about 3,000 additional hours. And that is almost exclusively at food pantries, at food drops, at LA Unified Meal Centers, at mobile testing sites, which the city has propped up to test over 70,000 people. It just gives you a sense of how mobility and circulation is changing, and how, sort of that new level of desperation and poverty that is now emerging and sort of during this pandemic, and I think after it. My sign shop, which is the group of folks who manufacture all of the stop signs and parking signs and all of those things throughout the city, every single one of them is on admin leave at home because they are all in vulnerable populations, because I have a huge part of my workforce that is eligible to retire, which is not unusual across the entire city. So thinking about sort of how these things, taking care of the workforce and taking care of the city, is really massively changing the operation. I have a transit system inside my transit system now that moves unsheltered Angelenos to temporary shelters or to hotels or motels if they need to quarantine. I have a couple of buses on loan to the fire department to actually go and implement mobile testing at encampments of folks who are currently living outside, so that if they test positive, they can get access to medical care. And we're now in the middle of propping up a meal delivery service for older adults who don't drive or can't drive, and who are afraid to be on public transit and are really increasingly isolated and cut off from services. So what do you do when you're sort of, your day-to-day operations change dramatically, but you still, we had very well-established values that we were trying to execute on. The mayor, Mayor Garcetti, had put out LA's Green New Deal, which had this incredibly ambitious program of infrastructure projects that we were getting ready to start implementing. We were finally making progress on our Vision Zero goals of reducing severe and fatal crashes around the city. And we were beginning what has been sort of a multi-year shift from thinking about the services that we deliver and the streets that we build, which we will always do, to thinking about the people we serve and what their needs are, and how we could use mobility to correct racial and socioeconomic inequity, to connect people to opportunity, to really do some kind of thoughtful engagement with the neighborhoods in Los Angeles to figure out how can we make sure that when we arrive in a neighborhood that has been, sort of undergone decades of disenfranchisement, redlining, that we are the government, and we have to be really, really thoughtful about how we come into those neighborhoods now, even if we are there with resources and we are there with ideas for investment. We have to exercise a high level of humility, because we need to understand that when we walk into those neighborhoods, we're carrying a legacy of decisions that came before us. So we've kind of boiled it down to a few different focused areas. The first is to make sure that we do no harm. So as the agency that writes parking tickets and adjudicates those parking tickets, one of the first things I wanted to do was to freeze parking fine increases citywide, to relax parking enforcement so that we were no longer going out and writing tickets and towing vehicles unless there were really significant safety issues, delayed when people needed to pay those things, made transit free, and attempted to do everything we could to protect the transit operators that are moving people on the bus. The second is crisis response, and I talked a little bit about that. Really remarkable sort of overnight creation and delivery of services that we never thought we would be in the business of doing. But then the last two categories, I think, are the ones that probably a lot of the folks on this, listeners on this webinar are interested in, which is, what are the opportunities that we have in front of us to emerge as we reopen our cities? I think first and foremost, every single department in the city of Los Angeles must be now in the jobs creation business. So nothing that we propose for transportation can be blind to the fact that anywhere from 15 to 30% of the jobs that were there before the pandemic are not coming back. And the folks who are most deeply impacted by that are undocumented Angelenos who are working in a whole bunch of jobs that won't return. So that has to be the grounding for how we think about and how we deliver any kind of opportunism. We have to make sure that the opportunity first and foremost is to get people back to work. But then what are the other opportunities that we have? I think that there are big opportunities to rethink how we deliver public transit. There are opportunities to rethink how we deliver micromobility. There are opportunities to rethink how we design and deliver our streets. And right now in this moment, there are big opportunities to expedite projects that were already approved, but that might have taken a really long time to construct because of all of the work that we have to do to manage the movement of traffic while construction is underway. So an example is that Metro, the County Transportation Authority is able to expedite the construction of the Purple Line, which is really going to be an incredible game changer for UCLA and the west side of Los Angeles. Because there's so little traffic right now, they're able to do things, close streets and do things they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. How can we think about that for protected bike lanes, for bus-only lanes, for wider sidewalks, for Vision Zero? And then how can we also think about these light touch tactical interventions that you see in some cities, slow streets or shared streets at places like Oakland and Denver, and now New York today announced 100 miles. But in all of those, the through line has to be, how can we make sure that we are not coming in with a heavy-handed top-down approach, that we do not, in our rush to get all of these projects that we're really excited to see come to life, we do not do damage that we don't intend to do by missing that centering and that grounding in the people that we're serving and in equity, which is what Susan mentioned.
Well, thank you, Selita. You really touched on so many key questions here. Let me start with one, connect a few dots of what you were saying, and that is with transit. So let me frame it a little bit, is that we're seeing some trends in, from a societal perspective going in the right direction, some going in the other direction, and there's some value judgments there, but the net effect of that is that we really need to figure out how to accelerate the good trends and mitigate the bad trends. And that means policy. So you say not too much of a heavy hand, but government does play a big role. And so let's focus on transit in particular. Transit already, for many years now, has been losing ridership. And now, of course, it fell off the cliff the last couple months. And yet it provides, not only does it provide an essential service for many people, but in the larger sense, it plays an important economic role, and to the whole well-being of our cities and people. So the question is, what do we do? And I'll maybe let you, Selita, start off with that a little bit. And I know Susan will have some ideas, but we need to keep this discussion tight, but if you have some quick thoughts on how do we revive it, Susan raised that question, how do we revive it, and what are some good ideas from a investment perspective, finance perspective, behavioral perspective?
Yeah.
A few good ideas?
Couple good ideas, couple ideas. We're going to have a no bad ideas session. How about that? And even if they're bad ideas, we're just going to let them roll, because that's where we need to be right now, right? We need to be in a place where we can really experiment with different ideas, yep. And not be beholden to whatever our agendas were before the pandemic. So I would say a couple things. Thing one is we will always need high capacity trunk line transit, especially in cities. And I do believe that, for example, on the Pico Union line, which is one of the only dash lines that sort of retained its ridership, we're now doubling the number of buses that we have on that line because we're limiting the number of riders. And so I think that in order to keep transit as that service that we elevate because it is so efficient, it will become even more important to preserve those that kind of transit prioritization, and whether that's bus only lanes or other bus rapid transit treatments, all of that stuff will be important. But then how could we think about, thinking about public transit as a suite of things that we concession and that we deliver? So is there a pod of electric vehicles that's available on demand at low or no cost in low income neighborhoods to serve some of those off-peak trips? Are there fleets of municipal bike share, municipal scooter share, including adaptive vehicles for people with disabilities that can be similarly made either really low cost or free, and that we think about them as part of our public transit, our public transit fleet, and we invest in them that way, so that we're not so reliant on the kind of boom and bust of the and the whims of the private markets, but that we're actually there to provide that stable, solid funding. I also think that there could be some interesting conversations to be had about these systems inside systems. So, the state of emergency has allowed us to experiment with the way that we deliver public transit services to vulnerable populations, and being able to design and custom design these routes that connect unsheltered Angelenos with hotels and motels and other kinds of services to the YMCA and to temporary shelters. That has been a really eye-opening and interesting sort of idea for the role that mobility can play in connecting vulnerable populations to services, and whether or not we ought to start designing some services like that.
So Susan, building on that, how adventurous, how revolutionary do we have to be with transit, and what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I really think policy flexibility is needed now. And I think about this every day. Is we've got this big opportunity with the $25 billion that have been dedicated to public transit. A question that I have for those dollars, right? They could go to shoring up fares that aren't being paid. That's important, but we already have some data coming in from the Transit Center. They did some projections of shortfalls that say that over just the course of a 12-month period, we could be in a shortfall between 26 billion and 40 billion. And that's just with paying off, those fare box revenues. So when we look at that 25 billion, a big question I have, Dan, thinking boldly about policy is, can that funding be used more flexibly? What would be the eligibility for it? And I think, Selita provided some really beautiful examples of more context sensitive, people sensitive solutions. So trunk line, absolutely. We have to keep funding that and keep those trunk lines going. But in areas where we might need more late night transportation services, or we're in more of a suburban or rural location, should we be thinking about other types of services like the microtransit services and what role micromobility itself can play? So I think what's really critical here is that we think out of the box and not in a traditional way. And I know that may sound really radical, but I think this is a time for us to be bold.
Yeah. So let me just extend what you said just a little bit, and that is that the way transit is funded is pretty much formulaic now. And a new way of thinking about it would be, how do we provide public transportation that is more tailored to the user's needs, look at it from a user perspective. And that's actually people have talked about it, but it's a more revolutionary idea than people would think, but it really is revolutionary in the transit world. So let me ask one more question. Actually, I picked it up off the Q&A already coming in, but I couldn't, but I know it's something that the three of us are very keen on, and that is getting back to behavior. So the question is, how many of these behaviors we're seeing now, where people don't want it, people are afraid of sharing, being next to other people, and that's on planes, that's on buses, and right away Lyft and Uber canceled their pooling services. And yet, really, any way you look at transportation, the sharing is key to creating a sustainable transportation system. Whether you look at it from an economic perspective, an environmental perspective, or a social equity perspective. So, any thoughts on which of these behaviors are going to persist and to what extent? And you might add, what can we do about it from a policy perspective? So, Selita, why don't you take a first cut at that?
Sure. Well, I remember a while ago, Robert Schneider, who is a great researcher, was involved in the TRB, Bicycle and Pedestrian Committees for a while, did some pretty great work about when people are most likely to change their travel behaviors. And it's when there are big milestone events in their lives, right? When they get married, or they get their first job, or they graduate from college, or their kids go off to school. That's the moment when they are willing to entertain things that are outside of their routine. So we are in a big moment of disruption, clearly, for a whole number of reasons that might allow us to think about what are the opportunities that could open up, and which ones might disappear. So, oil futures are now negative because nobody wants to buy the stuff and there's nowhere to store it. But how is the United States going to follow or get back in leadership position towards electrification with Europe and China in the moment we're in, and not see a big resurgence of driving? I was looking at the amazing mobility tracker that Apple Maps has been putting out, and depressingly, it's showing what we actually saw this last week in Los Angeles, is that driving is starting to creep back up. Cars are cheap right now. They're only going to get cheaper. And people have stored a lot of their debt in toxic car loans. And so there are going to be a lot of used cars that are going to get repossessed and come back onto the market at really low prices. So how can we make sure that we have a program, again, that aggressively invests in disentangling, to the extent that we can, auto ownership from auto access, and that when that auto access is important and necessary, it's electric? And how can we think about, Susan was talking about flexible investment ideas. One of those is the creation of a mobility wallet for folks that would allow them to access a large number of services, and that would actually provide them some assistance in accessing those services, and maybe even be able to disentangle identity from membership, because we have a lot of folks who live around MacArthur Park in Los Angeles who don't want to sign up for an EV car sharing service because they don't trust the government with their identity, because they're undocumented and they have worries about what that will mean. These are moments where transportation could sort of be leading the way and looking at integrated payments and mobility wallets for folks that give them access to a lot of those services that help get them away from the idea that they need to rush back into buying a car. LADOT Transit was actually bucking the trend of ridership declines, and we're actually seeing some ridership increases because we had massively redesigned our service and increased frequency where people wanted to use it the most. And I think those kinds of strategies can point the way.
Susan, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think economics can really help. So I think in a sharing model, when people start to understand how much money they have fixed in a particular asset like a car, and they see that they may be able to take trips in other different ways, they may make the calculus to get rid of a car, right? And so we have a lot of people who may be losing their cars because of these toxic leases and loans. And so an opportunity, I think, to get more into sequential sharing of vehicles like Selita's mentioned. I also think providing free transit would provide another one of those signals that, hey, I could take a certain amount of my trips on transit and others with shared modes. I think that in order to get people sharing again, we have to think about testing people. So making sure that we're doing our contact tracing and we're doing the testing of individuals so that we increase people's confidence that COVID isn't out everywhere. I think we can look at sanitizing these vehicles, and a lot of the shared mobility companies are already doing this and looking at innovations to doing this. I also think we need to think about new design and form factors. How could we potentially have multiple people in a vehicle but provide protective types of seating? And they're looking at that not just in vans themselves, but on airlines today. So these things I think can all come together to get people sharing and to share again. I think the closed pooled sharing, concurrent sharing could be more of a challenge. But I think we've got lots of things to work with, but I think behavioral economics is one that could really suit us well. And the mobility wallet that Selita mentioned is part of providing people with seamless routing, booking, payment options, as well as transparency about their costs of transportation.
Well, sounds like lots of good ideas there. Let's see what about implementation of some of them.
All right, let's get going.
We're counting on you, Selita. So Molly, let me turn it over.
You, Dan, come on.
So Molly, why don't you take it over in terms of some of the questions that are coming in?
Great. Yes. Thank you all so much. It's an honor to moderate this session, and obviously there's some great ideas being thrown around. We have about 700 people have logged in on our webinar, so there's a number of questions in the Q&A, and we certainly will not get to all of them today, but we have some good ones, some of which have already been discussed. And so I think I'll just recognize that a number of people asked questions about how we can avoid a resurgence in single occupant driving after the worst of the pandemic sort of wanes. And this is a question that was repeated throughout a number of people. This is getting at what we were just talking about opportunities for public transit. But I'll just ask if each of you could speak sort of to how we can envision a future where we don't see a huge surge in single occupant driving, and what, I guess, addressing some of the other questions people said, how do you address concerns and fears? And we did speak to that already, but just how do we consider the future going forward?
Well, I'd like to cast a big vote for telecommuting as a potential tool to keep single occupant vehicles down and to also ensure public health.
Telecommuting, yes, you can hear the noises of my home a little bit, and here, and you know, obviously we'll all become familiar with telecommuting's pros and cons.
Selita?
Oh, I've been, of course, I'm engaged in a lot of very future-looking and future-leaning kinds of initiatives and conversations, and I really enjoy that work around transportation technology and digital transformation and autonomous vehicles and drones and the rest of it. But I have found that I have found myself really just spending a ton of time reflecting deeply on how we are going to make sure that as we emerge and as we invest our transportation dollars, how can we make them go as far as possible? How can we make sure they are creating jobs? How can we make sure they're actually delivering services? So, for example, we have a program in Los Angeles called Play Streets, where we open up streets and pull up a box of play and turn a street into a park for a day in neighborhoods where people don't have access to open space. A lot of cities have programs like that, and I learned that Philadelphia, for example, uses it to actually distribute meals to kids during the summer when they don't have access to the meal programs at their schools. And I feel like that kind of thinking is really where I think we're going to derive the most satisfaction about the future. I think that it will be incredibly frustrating for any and all of us to try and control sort of the massive return to single occupant vehicles, because I just believe the form of our American cities and land use has made it such that that may be something that that is very, very difficult to push back on. However, in the moment that we have, in the moment that we're in, we can certainly reset the table for a different kind of conversation about the role of mobility in society, about how our dollars ought to be invested and really about loosening up and thinking about how can we give people access to the transportation option they need without the sort of rush to return to buying a vehicle, because that economic burden is going to be such in for a lot of households that they won't be able to choose. They'll have to choose between owning a home and owning a car.
Yeah, and I'll just add, so the equity concern is a very real one. There are many people that either don't have a car, or it's expensive, or it's unreliable cars. So let me tell a little personal note on that. I took the past year to go carless to see, both for professional reasons as well as I just believed in it. And it really became obvious to me that we need to do a much better job of linking these modes and supporting these other modes much better, and thinking about how do we use policy to accomplish that, and how do we support industry and businesses to do that. You know, I did it because I knew Lyft and Uber were available as a last resort at any time. It tends to be expensive, but it actually is much cheaper than owning a car, by the way. And so, you know, somehow changing the mindset to think about these other modes, whether it's scooters and bikes, providing better infrastructure, safe infrastructure for bikes and scooters, to supporting integration of public transportation with some of these ride-sharing services and with the micromobility, you know, really getting our leaders and, you know, focus on that and getting people to be thinking about those options, and of course dealing with the whole sharing notion and overcoming some of the fears of that. Okay, Molly, got another good question for us?
Absolutely. So there was a mention of micromobility, and I think that it's a topic that has come up a lot in the Q&A about our opportunities for embracing micromobility. By that I mean e-scooters and shared bikes, and also you know, and how that can play a role in both a response to the COVID-19 crisis, and also, you know, sort of how do we transition towards more use of these devices in the future. So that's a question, theme of many questions from the audience. So we've got a lot of bike and scooter fans.
Okay, so we can hear from the regulator and the academic here. So what do you say, Selita? You've dealt with this firsthand.
Yeah, and I was really excited when those services showed up, and worked really hard to figure out how we could build a system so that I wasn't going to put my finger on the scale of the market, and I was going to let as many companies come in and operate as many different business models. And that remains my focus, and not just for bikes and scooters, but all of the form factors that we see emerging, right? Mopeds and even, you know, little delivery robots or other kinds of vehicles that we see coming into the marketplace. And so I think, you know, our goal was always to create a future-proof set of regulations, and we fought really hard to make sure that we've designated those as essential transportation services. There was a lot of concern about them from, you know, reasonable concerns from the public and from policymakers. Can we guarantee that they're clean? Can we make sure that they don't create more of a viral vector for people? And so we put out some sort of guidelines and requirements for companies to clean their vehicles on a regular basis and push education information to people who are using those services. But I think that what's important, because I've seen some hot takes on micromobility, not from anybody on this panel, that are like, public transit is now part of the problem. Scooters are going to save us. And I just find that to be, first of all, incredibly ableist. You know, there are a lot of people who are not going to be able to use scooters. Older adults, people with disabilities, they're just not. It's also not mindful of all of the reasons why women might not feel comfortable on themselves on a scooter out in public, and why in certain neighborhoods, you know, Black, brown people of color, indigenous people of color don't feel comfortable on scooters and bikes out in public spaces because of profiling and other things. So we have to be really thoughtful about, there's no panacea. This is a really important part of an overall puzzle, and we cannot just talk about that part of the puzzle because we will alienate all of the other folks who desperately need other kinds of choices for how to get around.
But I'll just comment, Selita, I love, you're for me, the model policymaker, because you are saying, let's, if you say Uber, many mayors and city councils say, congestion, pollution. If you say scooters, they say, havoc and danger. And so, it's a new mindset is needed to think about transportation in a more forward-looking way. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Selita, for your leadership in micromobility and with the mobility data specifications. You've done a lot to move the discussion around access to data forward, and I think many of us are very grateful to you for your leadership in that. I wanted to just say a few things to tag on to Selita and Dan's remarks. I think micromobility is a fabulous thing. I think walking is really fabulous too. And I love the idea of micromobility, raising people's awareness of the importance of physical activity. I think that's really good for our overall public health and for our emissions. So I think looking at this as an opportunity is wonderful in the context of COVID, but I do want to raise a few flags here. So I do a lot of work on social equity, and one of the things that I am aware of is that some of these bikes and scooters aren't getting into the hands of the low-income individuals, so that when we look to where the scooters are winding up or where they start their day, they aren't as accessible to some of those individuals. So I really want us to think about, if we bring everything back after COVID-19, how do we ensure social equity? And maybe that comes by looking at rental models as opposed to pay by the minute models. I also wanted to raise an issue related to financial longevity of shared micromobility companies. For example, there's been a lot of discussion about those models needing more subsidy or more support. So there's been quite a bit of analysis out there, if you check it out, on companies like Bird about a low number of rentals per day per vehicle. And in the car sharing world where I cut my teeth, that was one of the key metrics we would look at every single day in order to know whether or not we were in viability land. So we may need to also revisit this idea of the financial model for shared micromobility moving forward, because I don't think the financial model of this is solved.
Absolutely. Yep.
I think let's just have a closing quick comments from Selita and Susan. Any thoughts before we turn it back to Molly?
I mean, we said a mouthful. I guess I would say, for me, for all of my peers in transportation, whatever your agenda was before the pandemic, and I'm sure they were all great, it's not the time to double down on that. It's the time, if there is any clearer indication that the universe wanted us to pause and listen and reflect, it's this. And so, the virus has exposed all kinds of things about transportation mobility and the way that society operates and depends on the services we deliver. It really is time for us to have a different kind of conversation about the purpose of what we do and who it serves and how we do it going forward. And so that's my plea, is just get out of your silo, talk to somebody that works in a field that's unfamiliar to you, and try and forge those new partnerships that Susan talked about, because that's the way we're going to come out of this better and stronger than we were when we went in, because going back to normal isn't really the best pathway forward. Let's move into something special and exciting and new that we can't even envision yet.
Amen. Susan?
Yeah, I just want to make a plea for us to really consider the lives of people who have lost their jobs, who are in serious distress, who have to make really difficult decisions between paying a car loan, paying rent, and getting food and healthcare. I think we've got to really move quickly to ensure that they are not left behind, and that we find jobs for them and we figure out how to make mobility work better for them, because these spatial mismatches that we have between jobs and work they don't make their lives any easier. And so I just really think we've got to all come together. This is a really important moment in time. It's the most pivotal moment in my life in transportation, and I think we should seize the day.
Thank you. And I'll say thank you to both of you, and I'll, for a phenomenal hour together. And Molly, take us home.
Thank you, Dan. And, I wish we had more time because there are about 100 questions we did not answer. So, time always goes so short, but we will look at the questions that were asked and aim to put them into sort of categories, because there was some themes throughout the questions, and try to address those categories together and follow up with you. We have published a blog article on this topic that addresses a lot of the questions that were asked. So we'll also share that with you. It's on our its.ucdavis.edu website. The next webinar from our Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program series is once again on May 18th at 2 p.m. And the focus will be on equity, community, and the Three Revolutions. We're really looking forward to having you all join us for that. So we can continue the conversation that we had here today. And, I'm hopeful with the number of people that came to participate in this event, that it's possible that the postponement or the cancellation of the Three Revolutions Policy Conference will end up being an opportunity for us to address some of these very serious issues that Susan and Dan and Selita have brought up today. Bring mobility to people who needed it, and really address the climate issues that we face. So with that, thank you all so much for staying with us for this hour, and I'll see you again in mid-May.